Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the second of two lectures introducing Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and in particular, the General Prologue. In the first lecture, we looked at Chaucer's life and works and the general structure of the Canterbury Tales as a whole. Now we're going to dive in this lecture into the General Prologue. So let's get started. So the opening lines of the General Prologue are famous, and it sets the stage for the Canterbury Tales as a whole. It announces the occasion of the poem's story and shows point of view or focus of attention that leads from the cosmic to from the biggest. And we'll describe this. It's really amazing what Chaucer does. It goes from this cosmic to the English and local within the first lines, and it presents this English event of a pilgrimage to Canterbury within the context of Latin philosophy and French intellectual culture. And this is what's unique about Chaucer and makes him, say, the father of English poetry and this first pillar of the literary landscape in England. So if we look at the opening lines, I'm not the best, I have to admit it, at reading Middle English. I'll give it a shot here. And with my students, I give them usually these interlinear translations. You know, we're not focusing and becoming Middle English specialists normally in the courses I'm teaching. So I think the interlinear translations are useful for them to make sure that they're catching the general sense of the work. However, it's good to have the original Chaucer there. There's a beauty in the language, even if we can't necessarily be experts in that language as deeply as we'd like to be. So let's start with these opening famous lines. One that April with the Charles suitor, the dracht of March hath pierced to the route, and bathed every vein in such liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower. One Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, tender crops, and the young sun hath in the ram his half coursey run, and small fowls mack and melody, that sleep in all the night with open ee. So pricketh him nature in her courages, then longen folk going on pilgrimages, and palmeros for to seek in strange strandes, to fern always coast and sundry lands, and especially from every sheer's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy bliss of martyr for to seek, that him hath hope and when they were sake. So first 18 lines, first full sentence of the Canterbury Tales we've just read there, and the interlinear translations there, if not every word was absolutely clear to you, but we'll unpack a bit of what's going on as well. So some of the literary echoes that are happening in these opening lines. There's an evocation of this genre called Reverdie, an old French poetic genre, which is a celebration of spring. So obviously, you know, when April with its sweet showers, you know, the celebration of the return of, let's say, life that happens with spring, the return of the crops, the foliage. It's an archetypal connections with the cycle of the seasons, also coupled with a spiritual rebirth. The major literary echo as well is to this important work called the Romance of the Rose, begun in 1230 by Guillaume de Lorry in France, continued by Jean de Meun, 1275 to 1280, and it's generally speaking, it's this huge work, but generally speaking, it's this large dream vision allegory in which the narrator seeks to pluck a rose from a walled garden, which symbolizes this romantic, erotic desire. So we get a lot of these courtly love imagery from this. And Guillaume's portion is courtly and idealized, and Jean's is a continuation of it, but it's satirical and more philosophical. The rose is defended by these allegorical figures like reason, shame, and jealousy, creating a psychological and moral drama as well. So major themes of courtly love and desire, kind of exploring these rituals and the contradictions within medieval romance. There's allegorical personifications used to identify abstractions and dramatize inner conflict. There's gender and power. So Jean de Meun critiques clerical misogyny and debates female agency. There's philosophical satire, which incorporates classical and scholastic ideas, often mocking authority and tradition. And the opening lines, it's interesting to see how there's a very similar, that it was May, thus streamed me. And so this is from, on the right, this is from Chaucer's translation of the Romance of the Rose. So Chaucer knew this work intimately, and it's in the background of the Canterbury Tales. And the lead up, discussing this spring setting, leads to then young folk intended I for to been gay and amorous. So then when all this is happening, when spring happens, young folk tend to be happy and amorous, get into sexual dalliances, so to speak. However, Chaucer's kind of reverses these expectations. These expectations are subverted in Chaucer's. In this time of rebirth, in the opening lines of Canterbury Tales, the rebirth of spring, all these things that are evoking what should be leading to these courtly love conventions of people seeking sexual dalliance, rather leads to spiritual renewal. So the climax is then longing folk to go on pilgrimages, rather than young folk intend to be happy and amorous. There's also learned discourse in the background of these opening lines. So Chaucer adds to the Romance of the Rose another tradition of Latin learned tradition. He doesn't simply tell you, for instance, that dews fell on the earth, as Guillaume does. He gives instead a brief scientific description telling how the dews engender the virtues, which means powers, which are the humors that will produce flowers. And he doesn't merely say it's April, he defines the time by exact reference to the cosmos, to the young sun just emerging from the zodiacal sign of the ram. So the first point there is around Chaucer incorporating more of, let's say, a learned discourse in this tradition. So adding to this tradition of courtly love literature, adding to it a kind of discourses from natural philosophy and other learned traditions. The other point here is in this reference to the zodiac signs that are referenced here. The action is seen as taking place. It's highlighted how it's taking place in this vast cosmos of, and we see on the right a depiction of this Ptolemaic universe that governed Chaucer's understanding, the Middle Ages understanding of the universe as geocentric, with the planets and the fixed stars revolving around the Earth. The setting takes place, the action is going to take place in this vast cosmic setting. The sun is happening here, it's in this zodiacal sign where the stars are. And then focuses in on England and this pilgrimage to Canterbury. All of this, these small events of pilgrims telling tales, belong within the whole, in this ordered, structured whole. Another thing I'll highlight here in terms of the literary tradition. So Chaucer's legacy is so vast, and T.S. Eliot, writing 500 years later, needs to point back to Chaucer in a time where, for him, the tradition is fragmented, and maybe the universe doesn't have this kind of ordered whole anymore for him. He needs to look back to these times, such as Chaucer, and to other great works of the tradition, as he pieces them together and, as he says it towards the end of his poem, shores these fragments against his ruin. In The Wasteland, the opening lines are a direct reference to Chaucer. Instead of joyous affirmation of rebirth, T.S. Eliot is writing about a time and people who are deadened and find any attempt to change or to grow or to live or to be with others, find that painful. So for them, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So again, famous lines for a modernist poem written over 500 years later and directly referring back to the opening of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So the narrator then says he's in this Southwark Tabard Inn, this inn in Southwark, this suburb of London, and he's waiting to go on his own pilgrimage when a group of sundry folk entered the inn. So a group of 9 and 20 joined. And the narrator then describes them and describes them in a certain political social orders. He begins with the nobility, knight, squire, yeoman, the clergy, beginning with the prioress, mentions briefly that she has a nun and 3 priests, and then the monk, the friar, and then these various city or town professionals. And you can see the list there. And then we have the wife of Bath, which is in the separate, let's say, widow category. And probably the 2 most outstanding and noble people morally are these spiritual brothers, the parson and the plowman. Then there are these agriculturalists, the miller, manciple, and the reeve. And finally, these grotesque brothers, the summoner and the pardoner. And outside of that 9 and 20 are the narrator and the host. So a great work I would recommend is Jill Mann's Chaucer and the Medieval Estates Satire, which shows the influence of Chaucer of this mode, let us say, rather than genre, of estate satire, which is a censorious survey of society. And the historical context is Chaucer's living in a time where the rigid estates of clergy, nobility, and commoners, that society could have these kind of 3 neat orders and everyone would kind of find their role there. That's being eroded as society is changing. There's a growing middle class and increased, say, trade and commerce that is blurring these lines considerably. The other thing that Chaucer is going to point to, well, first of all, he points to the fact that people are not situated so neatly in those 3 categories. And secondly, he's going to point to, let's say, the individual frailties and sinfulness of all individuals, which means that they can't live up to the ideals of their type and their class. While I'm thinking of great secondary works on Chaucer, I would be remiss if I didn't mention probably the greatest individual work on the Middle Ages, medieval literature in general, but also on Chaucer, called A Preface to Chaucer from 1962, I believe, by E.W. Robertson Jr. Incredible work, foundational text, as I said, of medieval literature, but also culture, etc. So this estate satire, in the ideal model, as I mentioned, there's clergy whose role is to instruct, provide moral authority. There's the nobility who protect, rule, the laborers who provide the material support for the other 2. In the ideal model, the members of all estates are to work together for the end of society as a whole, for the spiritual end, and as part of God's plan. And Chaucer's satire points to the limitations of this in its real functioning, how selfishness, sinful directions of individuals threatens to break this down. And Chaucer's work ultimately draws us to question the proper bonds of community within the pilgrimage of existence to our proper home. The rivalry among the members threatens the group, as does sinfulness. So the question of community, how we can be a real community in the pilgrimage that is our lives, is raised in the work. There is quite a bit of criticism of ecclesiastical excess in the Canterbury Tales. The ecclesiastical figures do not come off well, generally speaking, with the notable exception of the parson and his relationship to the ecclesiastical hierarchy is peripheral in the first place. Chaucer may have been influenced in this by a religious revival associated with the Lollards and John Wycliffe. So he knew he was associated with many of these Lollards through his different associations with noble families. And it's this anti-clerical movement pushing for reform of Christianity, a return to scripture, a vernacular translation of scripture, very prescient of later Luther's Reformation. So we can only, just point to the monk, the pardoner, the friar, the summoner, all portrayed as deceitful, greedy. Even the prioress, who's maybe portrayed a little bit more ambiguously, doesn't live up to the spiritual ideal of her office. The narrator, also named Geoffrey Chaucer, but I think we should not necessarily confuse this character with the author himself. So the narrator is naive and kind of seems to accept the ideal presentations of the characters. So the characters will present themselves in a certain way, and the narrator always presents them as a very perfect example of the type, and a perfect knight, a perfect prioress, what have you. But we as readers can see through that and see that they're not necessarily this. And obviously, Chaucer, the author, wants us to see that as well, and is not as naive as the narrator. So the characters are types to some extent. In fact, pointing back to Robertson's book, A Preface to Chaucer, he does a great job of demonstrating in a number of these characters. He'll refer Chaucer's description of them to medieval iconography, so visual representations in the statuary and other visual art associated with cathedrals or churches, where again these are presented as types of their social class, but also associated dangers with respect to sin or pride. So when we're reading, we need to pay attention to this description of their dress, their possessions, their behavior. And later on, this is about the General Prologue, but if you go on to read the Canterbury Tales as a whole, where these characters present a tale, though that can also flesh out our understanding of these characters. So if we look at the knight as one example of an ambiguous portrayal of the characters in Chaucer, so he's described as an ideal type of knight, and often critics will see only this aspect, and this is debatable, I would say, about the knight. But if we only see the noble aspect of the knight, we may be blind, let's say, to a potential social criticism as part of the Estates satire that's going on within Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So he is presented as this noble knight. However, there's several signs that he has blood on his hands, so to speak, that he does not manifest the chivalric ideal. Some of his battles are in the Middle East versus Arabs and Muslims, but others are against Christian nations in East Europe as a mercenary. And he was not involved in the battles of the 100 Years' War, notably the squire who's described later. That's where he was involved. And if we move on to the prioress, we see a similar ambiguity of presentation. She's described as this, again, perfect prioress, as head of a religious convent, but she's also described in highly eroticized manner. So her eating habits are described in the same terms as those of the teacher of courtesans in the Romance of the Rose. Her physical form is of great interest to the narrator. So her eyes are described like those of Guinevere in the Arthurian legends. And Guinevere, of course, ends up having that adulterous affair with Lancelot. And Prioress herself is a social creature of aspiration and desire. Higher, high, hardly the individual one might see as a head of a convent. And here, if we look at some lines describing her, but to speak of her moral sense, she was so charitable and so compassionate. She would weep if she saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bled. She had some small hounds that she fed with roasted meat or milk and fine white bread. So maybe misdirected compassion here, and these hounds are fed better than probably 95% of people living in England at the time. About her arm she bore a small coral, a set of beads adorned with large green beads, and thereon hung a brooch of very bright gold, on which there was first written an A with a crown, and after love conquers all. So that amor vincit omnia is a reference to God as love is what conquers all, but we get the impression that for the prioress it's a different focus. It's maybe amorous love, it's greed, this fine jewelry. Her focus is not necessarily on the spiritual. The monk, another figure, you can see the lines there, 165 to 207, is a manly man and the head of an abbey. He doesn't follow the rules appointed for his order. He's an individual of great appetites, and he's constantly described in terms of his food. And if we look at the lines, the rule of St. Maurice or of St. Benedict, because it was old and somewhat strict, this same monk let old things pass away and followed the broader customs of modern times. He gave not a plucked hen for that text that says that hunters are not holy men, nor that a monk, when he is heedless of rules, is like a fish that is out of water. That is to say, a monk out of his cloister. So the fact that he's out of his cloister, he doesn't follow these rules that he should stay within the cloister, and it's completely heedless of that. Does not follow traditional spiritual teachings. Then the pardoner, perhaps most disturbing of all, this seller of false relics, the last character to be described, who claims to be able to give his purchaser time off from purgatory. And this was a real issue, and it became later in the Reformation another, again, a point of contention is the selling of indulgences, where you would either for oneself or for a loved one purchase time that they would be saved from having to go through the purification of one's soul through purgatory. So the whole concept seemed to be ludicrous and to the thinking individual. And the pardoner is Chaucer's brilliant portrayal of how that can lead to the type of individual that seizes on that to further their own greed and pride. So he appears as this grotesque figure, physically disturbing. He's oddly dressed, and the narrator says, "I trow he were a gelding or a mare." So I believe he states that he was a eunuch or a homosexual. So the non-normative sexual identity is potentially caricatured here, or it's just part of the real world versus idealized portrait of the three estates. Like so Chaucer shows people in their diversity, and in some ways, rather than seeing that diversity as disturbing, in some ways Chaucer wants us to say, okay, yeah, people, there's a lot of different people here, and they don't fit into these three types. Okay. What seems to be genuinely threatening about the pardoner, though, is his power with words, as let's say, as opposed to his non-normative sexuality. His power with words is his ability to convince people that through these relics, these false relics that he sells, that they will be able to save their souls. The pardoner remains one of the most fascinating of Chaucer's literary creations, and he comes to represent the antitype of Chaucer's own sense of what to do with language and how to use language to, let's say, bring forth best of individuals. He had a cross of Latin covered with stones, and in a glass container he had pig's bones. But with these relics, when he found a poor parson dwelling in the countryside, in one day he got himself more money than the parson got in 2 months. And thus, with feigned flattery and tricks, he made fools of the parson and the people. So we've looked at a few of the characters that are portrayed there. Obviously there's 29 of the characters, not all of which get full descriptions, but most of them do. And it would take us too long to go through each one, but you get a sense of how they don't live up to ideal types. They all are filled with individual foibles, etc. So what's Chaucer on about here? What could be his teaching or his secret teaching what's beyond, let's say, the literary obscurity here? Well, we said in the first lecture that the objective, as set down by Harry Bailey, the host, in telling the tales themselves will be to tell tales of best sentence and most Solaas. So the best moral instruction and the best entertainment value. So we can assume that for the many, the objective, let's say the broad masses, the objective is to provide poetic entertainment. And that's what Chaucer does, or Solaas. For the few, let's say, we can assume that Chaucer intended maybe a deeper teaching or a wise sentence. And let's remind ourselves, and I'll put a link in the description to my lectures on medieval literary theory where we go into this in more detail, but let's remind ourselves that in the Middle Ages, there's this elaborate scheme of fourfold method of interpretation, often called the Quadriga. That there are 4 levels to interpretation, and the Middle Ages were attuned to literary obscurity and to texts having multiple levels of meaning, more so than the modern age. So they had developed a rich scheme of allegorical interpretation. And you can see from this chart, the 4 levels are the literal or historical, so the actual events as they happen, the allegorical, so how the events relate to the church, to Christ, tropological or moral, so kind of the moral instruction of how an individual soul should act, and the anagogic meaning leading upward, and how this is like a prophetic meaning pointing towards heaven and the last things. So if we were to relate these 4 levels to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the characters, as in the literal level, are just a diverse group of pilgrims from different classes traveling from London to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, and they tell some tales. So that's literally what happens in the work. Allegorically, the characters and events can be seen as representing greater spiritual truths. The pilgrimage itself can be interpreted as an allegory for the human soul's journey through life, from earthly existence to the heavenly city. And the character's flaws, such as the pardoner's greed or the friar's manipulation, can allegorically represent the corruption within the medieval church. And the parson's tale, the narrative directly engages with Christian doctrine and serves as an allegorical guide to salvation. The moral level, in terms of what moral lessons, sometimes overtly, but sometimes through figures, we see examples or negative examples of moral instruction. The Tale of Melody is a classic example where we see a teaching of the acceptance of one's fate within a divinely ordered world. And then the anagogic level, in terms of leading to our final ends, this level connects the tales to the ultimate spiritual journey of the pilgrimage, the eternal destination, heaven, and the journey to the shrine of Thomas Becket. A physical destination points to our spiritual journey toward heavenly Jerusalem. And ultimately, the Canterbury Tales ends with Chaucer's retractions, where he asks forgiveness for his more worldly works and focuses on the parts of his works and writing that lead to that spiritual salvation. So it's almost as though with the retraction, there's a desire to, climb up the ladder, this upward leading anagogic ladder, and then kind of kick the ladder away and say, okay, well, we don't need those literary tales anymore. So what would be the esoteric doctrine? So I think the fourfold interpretation is part of it. And Chaucer's esoteric doctrine also seems to be that the wise individual questions the idealized ordering of people into three estates or the three classes that are outlined in his own society, but also in Plato's Republic. So we just can't take the words of these characters at face value. They must be measured against the physical description of the actions, also as in Plato. So in Plato's dialogues, we have to look at the words, but also the deeds, right? So I have a video on how to read a Platonic dialogue. So I'll put a link in the description. And interestingly, there Chaucer says, these are lines 741 to 742. Also, Plato says, whoever knows how to read him. So this is very interesting, I think, and hasn't been picked up in the Chaucer scholarship. But also, Plato says, whoever knows how to read him, because there are deeper meanings to Plato than what might be on the surface, just as there are deeper meanings to Chaucer than might be on the surface, I think we're to say. As Plato says, whoever knows how to read him, the words must be closely related to the deed. Okay? So just as in Plato, the words are related to the deed, if you read him closely, so too in reading Chaucer. We have to take the words of the characters and relate them to the deed, to the narrative frame, to how they're presented in terms of their dress, their actions. So to end off, I'll remind you of this kind of ongoing history of esotericism we're looking at. We started with a description of an introduction to esotericism, including philosophic esotericism. We looked at the fourfold method, the Quadriga in medieval literary theory. We looked under the first category of ancient Greek and Roman in terms of works that exemplified that. We looked at Plato's Republic as exemplifying philosophic strains of esotericism. And Chaucer's Canterbury Tales can be seen as within this medieval tradition of esotericism. So moving on to the modern age, esoteric literature takes a number of shifts, as we'll see. And stay tuned for those discussions in future lectures. Thank you very much.